Deborah and her grandmother lived on the outskirts of the village, near the forest, and often went there to collect medicinal herbs. The grandmother was considered a healer by all the neighbors, who often turned to her for help to get their husbands out of a binge, to increase milk production for nursing mothers, or to strengthen a man's vitality. However, they had enemies too, who considered them witches and avoided the herbalist's house like the plague. Deborah did not know her parents at all. Her grandmother had always been by her side for as long as she could remember. It was not difficult for her to understand that her grandma simply healed with herbs, which Mother Nature generously gave them every summer. She herself already knew the name and power of each herb growing in her beloved forest. But shortly, Deborah's happy childhood came to an end. Her grandmother fell ill and never got up. But the one who had helped other people all her life could not help herself. "Deborah, don't cry for me when I die. I will always be with you. Don't be afraid. Go to people. Just be careful. Poke them in the heart. Don't let vile people near you. Use the light in you. Don't lose it. And if trouble happens, I will come to you in a dream and tell you where to find the truth." The grandmother died at dawn. Sapphire neighbors helped Deborah bury her. Returning from the funeral, the girl looked around. The orphaned house now seemed somehow foreign without her dear grandmother. Deborah sat by her bed and looked at the pile of pillows covered with a lace bedspread. She couldn't gather her thoughts. She had to somehow continue living. But how? Deborah had just finished school, but now there could be no talk of further education. She had to find a job. "Deborah, are you home?" Connor, Deborah's former classmate, stood in the doorway. He'd been asking her to marry him since childhood, but the girl only laughed at the snub-nosed, stunted beau. "But where else could I be?" She sighed. "I'm sitting here thinking about where to go now. I came just for that. I heard my mother say they need a postal worker. Aunt Vera got sick and went to her son, and now there is no one to do her job. Go to the post office. Maybe they'll take you." Deborah immediately ran to the nearest post office, and by evening was hired as a new mail carrier. The job was hard. The bag was tearing her shoulder and her leg hurt. Her legs were giving out by evening, but the girl didn't give up. Although this job brought her just a small income, it was her own earnings. Sit there at the post office, Deborah met Mick, the polite and well-managed guy who offered to help the fragile girl with her huge mailbag. They struck up a conversation, and since then, Mick began to visit the post office more and more often. He was 10 years older than young Deborah, but even though he was already a fairly grown-up person, he often referred to his mother's opinion in conversation. Deborah should have realized that she was dealing with a typical mama's boy, but the girl was inexperienced, and it seemed to her that if she had a mother, she would certainly listen to her opinion. Date. Invitation on the day when Mick decided to introduce Deborah to his family. The girl felt like she was on cloud 9. Mick proposed to her, and she, an orphan, would soon become a member of a worthy family. was lonely and inexperienced, Deborah thought that her life would be just as happy and carefree as when her beloved grandmother was alive. Mick's parents accepted her quite warmly, but the day before they had a serious conversation with their son, trying to convince him not to marry a poor girl, especially an orphan. Alas, their son was stubborn for almost the first time in his life, and they gave up. At the meeting, Mick's parents smiled sweetly at Deborah, and she had no idea of their real attitude towards her. Soon the young couple got married, and just a month later, the newlyweds announced to their parents that they were expecting a baby. By that time, Deborah had resigned from her job. Mick's parents insisted that she should not work as a mail carrier. They were ashamed before their acquaintances that their daughter-in-law was engaged in such an unprestigious job. Thus, on the day when Deborah was told during an ultrasound that she would have a boy, Mick was the happiest person in the world. He brought his wife a huge bouquet, and his mother gave the bride a gold ring. "This is our gratitude to you for our future grandson. My husband and I always dreamed of a boy as smart as our Mick." Look how cute he was. Eleanor handed her daughter-in-law childhood photos of her son. "It is necessary that the baby looks like Mick. He will be such a cute child." It was somehow strange. According to Eleanor's words, it turned out that Deborah could somehow influence the appearance and mental abilities of the future child. Moreover, it sounded as if Mick's parents really did not want the baby to resemble Deborah in any way. But on the eve of the birth, Deborah dreamed of her grandmother, and for some reason, she was crying and shaking her head, looking at her granddaughter. Deborah woke up with some incomprehensible feeling of anxiety. A couple of hours later, the contractions began, and she no longer had time to think about the meaning of this dream. At first, everything was going well in the hospital, and the doctor reassured Deborah that childbirth preparation was going as planned. But then everything suddenly changed. As a nurse barged into the pre-delivery room and demanded that Mick leave. "She's going for a C-section," she told the shocked guy. "What C-section?" "We're having a natural birth," Mick tried to argue. "How do you know?" The nurse began to shout. The doctor ordered her to be urgently prepared for surgery. That means he has some new information and indications for surgery, Mick thought. At that moment, the doctor delivering the baby rushed into the ward with a frightened face.
"Why isn't she ready yet?" "Urgently to the operating room," he said.
Nick and Deborah tried to prove something, but no one listened to them. Deborah was taken away, and the guy couldn't sit still, not understanding what could have happened. He walked back and forth in the corridor, all the time listening to the sounds from the operating room. And for a moment, he even heard the cry of a baby. "My son was born," flashed through his mind, his heart beating happily, and he breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm the father."
"I'm very sorry. Your child was stillborn," he said dryly.
"I can't believe my ears." "You probably got something mixed up," Mick said. "I heard a baby cry," he said.
"That baby was born to another woman in a neighboring operating room," the doctor replied.
You heard the cry of someone else's baby." The doctor replied in a tone that brooked no objections. "Your wife will soon come to her senses, and you will need to talk to her to avoid any hysterics," the doctor said. "She's young. You'll have more children," he added. Deborah couldn't believe what Mick told her. She couldn't believe that her little baby, who had been tossing and turning in her belly and kicking with tiny legs just yesterday, her beloved, long-awaited son, had left forever. She didn't believe it, even when they brought out the lifeless body of the newborn, and she refused to even look at him. Mick himself took and buried his son. He would come to the little grave and cry for hours. Deborah began to distance herself from her husband further and further. She stubbornly insisted that her son was alive and made Mick more and more angry with her words. The grandmother came to her granddaughter in a dream again and again, looking at her and crying, but for reason she couldn't say anything to her, as if she didn't have the strength. Deborah felt that something was going very wrong in her life, but she couldn't understand what exactly was wrong and what she could do to fix it. Her mother-in-law constantly turned Mick against her, convincing him that there would be no use from Deborah. "Look at her," she would say. Not only did she give birth to a dead child, she also lost her mind. She keeps insisting that her son is alive. She never goes to her son's grave. She would then urge Mick to divorce Deborah. "Otherwise we'll all go crazy here." And after 6 months, the young couple divorced. Deborah went back to her village and settled in her old grandmother's house. She got a job at the post office again and lived as a recluse. More and more often, she began to collect herbs as her grandmother once did. She started helping people like her grandmother used to do in the old days. Just in her spare time, Deborah wandered through the forest, collecting medicinal plants and listening to the singing of birds. And at night she dreamed more and more often of a red-haired and blue-eyed boy, just like herself. It was strange that with each passing day in her dreams, he became more and more grown up. At first, he was a child who had just learned to walk. Then he ran to her in his sleep, and after 2 years, he was already a very independent boy. "Billy," Deborah would whisper in her sleep, "my son, how can I find you?" Deborah didn't tell anyone about her dreams, but sometimes she felt like she was going crazy. But she eagerly awaited night after night to see her child again. As if he were real. She held him in her arms, stroked his unruly curls, sang him songs in her sleep, and looked at his smiling face. Deborah was afraid to tell even Connor about these dreams. He had been her friend all her life, had been there for her constantly since she returned to the village, trying to make her happy in any way he could. But Deborah still wouldn't let him get close to her. She had enough of the treacherous betrayal she had experienced with Mick. Connor didn't push himself on her. He was just there and offered a helping hand to the lonely woman when she needed it. Grandma didn't come to Deborah's dreams anymore, as if she had taken her grandson by the hand and brought him into Deborah's dreams and stopped bothering her granddaughter. But one night, the grandmother came back to Deborah in her sleep. She was just like in life. This time she wasn't crying. Deborah clearly saw that the old woman's face was anxious, and she wanted to say something. The grandmother tried to call her granddaughter, took her hand in her sleep, and led her to the road. Deborah woke up and couldn't understand what her grandmother wanted from her and where she was calling her to. The dream repeated itself the next night, but this time, Deborah was prepared. "What do you want to tell me?" Deborah whispered in her sleep.
I want to hear you.
"Tell me."
Your son's alive. I will show you the place where he lives.
Deborah felt like she was flying, just like in her childhood dreams. She saw a familiar forest and beyond it a large mansion. Although she had never been there, Deborah knew that there was a city beyond the forest. The mansion was very luxurious, with a huge garden that had fountains, shady alleys, and green lawns. Approximately as Denwick Sai, when Deborah woke up, she was in a daze for a long time. She couldn't stop thinking about her dream, which had felt so real. She decided to go on a trip and see the mysterious mansion with her own eyes. At first, the road through the forest was familiar to her. She had walked here many times in her childhood and knew every path. Next then came unfamiliar places, swampy and impassable areas. Deborah was already thinking of abandoning this foolish idea and returning home before it got dark. But suddenly, the forest abruptly became brighter and better maintained. Soon, through the trees, she could see the cottage of a prestigious country village. Deborah came out to the edge and stopped dead in her tracks. The house from her dream was right in front of her. She couldn't mistake it for any other. She saw its image so clearly. You see, on the lawn in front of the house, a 3-year-old boy was misbehaving, judging by the reproaches of an elderly woman who appeared to be his nanny. Deborah approached closer. To the rays of the setting sun shone directly into her eyes, making it difficult to see the boy's face. She tried but couldn't tell if he looked like the boy from her dream. "Billy!" Accusations. "Billy, your father will scold us for being late again. Let's go home, please." The boy ran away with a scream and immediately collided with Deborah, who was standing there in shock. She couldn't believe her eyes. This was her little Billy, the same boy she had been seeing in her dreams for more than 2 years. "Wait, don't run away," Deborah stopped the boy. I saw a kitten under the bush somewhere. Let's look for it together." She took the boy by the hand and led him to the bush, while signaling to the nanny. "Wait," Deborah said, looking for a way to keep the woman talking and engage her in conversation. "Do you happen to know if they're looking for a maid in this house? I can clean or cook. I'm good at many things." Deborah is looking for a way to keep the woman talking and engage her in conversation.
"I'm sorry, but no, they won't be hiring anyone," the nanny replied. "The owners are moving to Spain soon, and the house will either be closed or sold." The talkative nanny was happy to discuss the owner's business.
"Hey, little one," Deborah joked with the child. "You'll soon become a real Spanish macho." Deborah said. "Do you know who toreadors are?" she asked. "Perhaps they're the bravest, not afraid of big bulls." Deborah asked, "Are you brave too?" Obsessions. I'm the bravest, the little boy declared confidently. And how old are you? It's almost my birthday, and my dad promised to give me a puppy. The little one shared his excitement with her. Yes, his birthday is next Friday, the nanny confirmed. We celebrate and then go to Spain, she said to the boy. Deborah listened and understood that her son would have turned 3 years old on the same Friday. How is it possible that a child born on the same day as her deceased son could be in front of her by chance? Well, I wish you a good journey and a happy birthday. Deborah stroked the child's head, unnoticeably taking a small strand of hair from his head. It was getting dark fast, and she didn't go back through the woods. The woman went out on the highway and caught a hitchhiking car. Now Deborah couldn't waste a minute. Soon, very soon, they would take Billy to Europe forever. That's what her grandmother warned her about in the dream. She urgently needed to do a DNA test and finally understand if this was her child or if she had gone crazy. Connor was still awake when Deborah burst into his house with burning eyes, holding a small bundle in her fist. Connor, I need your help. I urgently need to find a laboratory to mail a DNA test. I can't tell you why, otherwise you'll think I've gone crazy. At in the morning, he drove her to the city with the coveted strand of hair, which now held so much in her life and the life of one little boy. Deborah was terrified that she wouldn't get the result before Billy left for Spain. But 4 days later, the DNA test result was ready, and she held the coveted document in her hands. Connor, you won't believe what I have. Look, it says here that the degree of relationship between me and Billy is 99.9. Which Billy? Deborah, what are you talking about? Finally, Deborah told Connor everything that had been happening to her lately. He knew, of course, that she had lost her child, but he couldn't expect Deborah to still consider him alive. Moreover, she was still looking for him. And the fact that she found her son alive in someone else's family was more like the delirium of a maidwoman. However, the document is real, official. There's no doubt about it. But how? How did she find him? Are you sure you're not a witch? Connor could not find explanations for everything that was happening. That was happening, Connor. It doesn't matter now. My Billy will be taken abroad any minute now, and I will lose him forever. Okay, we must go to these people right now and solve everything on the spot. And then it was even scarier to confess to my actions. It was a terrible confession. People couldn't believe that a doctor would stoop to such a low. But now they at least understood how such confusion with the babies could have occurred. Deborah took Billy. His adoptive parents had to come to terms with the loss, and the child had to get to know his biological mother and get used to her. The doctor and nurse were sentenced. Stations and vaccines. A maternity hospital began strict checks, as a result of which a number of violations were revealed, although not as egregious. It was difficult for many at that time, but Deborah was happy for the first time in years. The boy quickly got used to her. He'd been raised exclusively by nannies since childhood, who were often changed over these 3 years because of the whimsical character of the mistress of the house, Paula. Therefore, when a new mother appeared in his life, who spent all her spare time with him, sang him lullabies at night, walked with him holding hands, he easily became attached to her. Billy's previous family still went to Spain as planned, taking promises from Deborah to send them photos of their son, videos of him, and to have video communication at least once a week. In fact, they were good people and suffered no less than Deborah in this situation. A year later, Paula successfully carried and gave birth to a baby girl under the vigilant supervision of doctors. Deborah was glad for her. She was grateful to fate and her late grandmother, who kept her promise and did not leave her without her patronage. And even from the afterlife, she helped to return her son. And Deborah was also grateful to Connor for being the only one in this whole world who always supported her and helped her to get Billy back. Deborah eventually married him, and one night, her grandmother appeared to her again in a dream. She showed Deborah a tiny girl sitting on the lawn in front of their house, among the daisies and smiling. The next day, Deborah found out that she was expecting a baby. She confidently told her husband, "We will have a girl, and we will name her in honor of my grandmother." However, this is an entirely different story.